Yay. Hi.
Hello. Glad to see you.
Hi, glad to see you. And here's the book. I think I'm lagging a little bit. Maybe I'll catch up.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so it is 6:04. We have people. Welcome to Detroit Public Library's virtual author series. My name is Christine Peel. I'm a librarian here at the Detroit Public Library, the Edison branch, if you're worried about my safety. Because if you know, we've had a bunch of flooding in Detroit and the main library had some damage. So they're working on that right now. So no one, not a lot of staff over at main library. So tonight we're here to talk about Edward McClelland's new book, Miracle in Vehicle City. Edward is a native of Lansing, which he mentions is the birthplace of Burt Reynolds in the Oldsmobile.
Yeah.
His most recent book, Midnight in Vehicle City, General Motors, Flint, and the Strike That Built the Middle Class, is a narrative account of the 1936 to 1937 Flint Sit-Down strike, which led to the establishment of the United Auto Workers as the nation's flagship labor union. Solidarity forever, I'm a member. His previous book, How to Speak Midwestern, is a guide to speech and sayings of Middle America, which the New York Times called a dictionary wrapped in some serious
dialectology.
Thank you. Inside of a gift book trailing a serious whiff of relevance. After getting his start in journalism at the Lansing Community College, Lookout, Ted went on to work for the Chicago Reader, where he met Barack Obama during his failed 2000 campaign for Congress. His coverage of that race became the basis of Young Mr. Obama, Chicago, and the Making of a Black President. Ted's writing has also appeared in the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, Columbia Journalism Review, Salon, Slate, and Playboy. He will be in conversation this evening with Aliqae Geraci, who is the new director of the Wayne State Reuther Library. And she previously worked as a public librarian and a union researcher. She's an active public library advocate, and she was a member of the local 1321 Queens Library Guild, an analyst in ASME District Council 37. Most recently, she served as chair of ALA APA Salaries and Status of Library Workers Committee and the co-chair AFL-CIO Labor Committee. And she joined Reuther just at the start of, there was an incident that started in March of last year. And she kind of got
just a little pandemic.
Yep, just a little. And she got, but she started just in time. So you guys can get the conversation started.
All right. Well, I did a lot of my research at the Reuther Library, so you picked the right person to interview me. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for the introduction, Christine. So glad to meet you today, Edward. So as Christine mentioned, I'm the newest director of the Walter P. Reuther Library, Archives in Labor and Urban Affairs at Wayne State University. And so in addition to being named for Walter Reuther, longtime president of the UAW, Reuther Library is also the official repository of the United Auto Workers records, as well as the papers of Walter Reuther, Roy Reuther, Victor Reuther, many other players in the events described in Midnight in Vehicle City.
Right, and that's why I spent so much time there.
Exactly. So I'm just so pleased to be here. We're also located across the street from Detroit Public Library, and I'm really here not to represent my employer, but as a avid supporter of DPL and somebody who's passionately interested in labor history. So yeah, I'm so fascinated to hear more about your thought process and coming to the topic of your book, Edward. I mean, you are born and bred in Lansing. You're from Michigan.
Yeah.
You grow up here, and you must have been kind of taught or told about the lore of the Flint Sit-Down strike and about the rise of industrial unionism. What was that like for you?
Well, I certainly was surrounded by industry and unionism when I was growing up. My high school was right across in Lansing, was right across the street from a Fisher body plant, which has since been demolished. And I mean, the UAW was such a big deal in town that they would have advertise on the radio during the elections for local president. So, you know, our high campus was surrounded by, you know, the UAW locals and shop bars and, you know, industry. And I'll never forget just inhaling the smell of paint when I was running track drifting from across the street from Fisher Body. And I mean, that Fisher Body plant has been shut down. They built a new one out in Delta Township. So yeah, I mean, I certainly grew up surrounded by the auto industry, and I think I became more interested later on. A close family friend of ours, a guy named Everett Ketchum, was one of the last surviving sit-down strikers. He died in 2013 at the age of 98, and he was a guy who was always over for Sunday dinner. He actually married my stepmother's mother after they were both widowed. And he couldn't have been any more a part of our family. And to me, you know, just the course of his life exemplified the victories of the sit-down strikers. I mean, he started out making 25 cents an hour as an apprentice in the 1930s. And by the time he retired in 1976, he was making $27 an hour as a tool and die maker. And, you know, he owned a bunch of rental property. He moved over to Oldsmobile when he married a woman who worked at Michigan State, and they owned a bunch of rental properties in East Lansing that they rented to students. And he actually kind of became this anonymous local celebrity. You know, he used to like to flirt with all the waitresses at the Pancake House, and he noticed that one of them would always cover her mouth. And he said, "Why do you cover your mouth?" And she showed him how bad her teeth were. And he said, "Well, how much would it cost to fix that?" And she said, $14,000. And he wrote her a check. So really, you know, those skilled tradesmen had the best jobs in town. You know, they made good money, and they got to keep their health insurance for their entire life, which was probably why Everett lived so long.
I love that story in the book about him noticing her covering her mouth and then being able to, you know, provide the material support that changed their life. And we think about, you know, how the bonds of community are often facilitated by this type of material support, and his job, his great, you know, well-paying, solid union job made that possible. Yeah.
And he was part of the company choir, you know, the Rocketeers. They wore silk shirts, and they would sing at the annual Christmas party. And, you know, he very proudly wore his 25-year ring for his entire life. So, you know, GM really provided a lot of people with a lot of prosperity and with a good life for a long time.
As like a relatively new, you know, member of a Michigan resident, a Detroit resident, one thing that's been really fascinating for me is to learn more about the very specific company and union cultures, like, you know, specific fraternal activities that there were, or social activities that were built around, you know, the plant workplace structure. You know, I'm from New York, where a lot of my exposure to the labor movement and labor history was around our specific history and the organizing of like the public sector, of healthcare, of service workers, and in you know, the textile and needle trades unions. So, you know, I came up learning about certain like pageants put on by the ILGWU or different plays. So it's been really amazing being in Detroit and the Detroit metro region and learning about the different cultural efforts that came out of like automobile worker communities.
Yeah, well, GM always had that association, the Industrial Mutual Association. You they had bowling leagues, they had baseball leagues, they, had visiting opera stars and book clubs, and, the IMA auditorium, I think it seated, maybe 7,000 or 8,000 people. And, if you talk to anybody from Flint, that's where they saw their first rock concert, at the IMA auditorium, which is probably, I'm sure it's been demolished like so much else in Flint.
Mm-hmm. But of course, that it wasn't like that from the beginning. It was like that in the 20s. I mean, I guess it was part of GM's kind of paternalism. GM really controlled the whole town. I mean, they built this housing development called Civic Park, and so they held the mortgages on people's houses, and they organized people's leisure time through the IMA and through trips out to a local lake. And so, Flint was really a company town, and nobody was really, people were afraid to cross General Motors until the UAWA showed up. And I don't know at what point do you want me to read any? Yeah, I think that would be fantastic. Because I was really struck by how you described how delicate workers' ties to the company were, how often the discretion of the foreman was really key in allowing somebody to work. And if your foreman showed up at your house after work, and he wanted a party, you threw him a party because that's what kept you on the line.
So I thought I'd start by reading that part. I thought I'd read that part about from the beginning about what the working conditions were like that triggered the strike. This is from chapter 1, a stranger in town. The heat wave begins on the Great Plains in the Dust Bowl, the dead dry land whose barren fields have transformed it into a furnace. The summer of 1936 is the hottest anyone can remember. After killing the meager yield of crops in the farm states, the dome of heat spreads north and east, smothering the Great Lakes. In the second week of July, every afternoon, workers preparing for second shift at the General Motors plant in Flint, Michigan, look out the kitchen windows of their company-built Cape Cods and slope-roof bungalows at the thermometers bolted to the walls. The gauge is filled with red mercury, measuring triple-digit temperatures, 108 degrees, 105 degrees, 102 degrees, 104 degrees, day after miserable day in the lush, humid Saginaw Valley. It's so hot inside these brick factories. They were built to trap warmth during the hard winters, but they're kilns during this heat wave, even with all the windows cranked open. There are no fans to cool the workers, no air conditioning. Building automobiles is a strenuous, sweaty occupation, even during mild weather. The assembly line never stops moving, not once in 8 hours. If the company needs more cars, it cranks up the speed. Men who can't keep up don't keep their jobs, so the workers go home exhausted, too tired to talk to their wives and children, too tired to do anything but eat and sleep. They endure it because every day there's a line of men outside the personnel office, hungry for a job in this depression. Gilbert Gibb Rose has one of the toughest jobs at General Motors, grinding crankshafts at Chevrolet plant number 4, called Chevy 4, the engine plant in the Chevrolet complex, a collection of factories that steams and smokes and clanks all day and night on the south bank of the Flint River. One of the plants in that complex is nicknamed Chevy in the Hole, either because it lies in a depression along the river or because it's a hellhole, probably both. The crankshafts weigh 108 pounds, and Rose has to lift each one off the assembly line, set it on a grinding rack, and carry it back to the line when it's finished. By the end of the long shift, he will have lifted tons of metal with his bare hands and bare arms. Not even plow horses pull so much weight during a day. The men in the crankshaft department are the biggest and strongest at GM, men in the prime of their working lives. The company doesn't like workers over 40. It looks for reasons to fire them in favor of younger hires. But even the strongest are not stronger than this heat wave. On the day the thermometer spikes at 108, the hottest ever measured in Flint, 4 of Rose's co-workers faint on the assembly line. They're rolled onto stretchers and carried off the shop floor, but the crankshafts never stop coming. Get him on a stretcher and get him the hell out of here, a foreman shouts every time a man collapses. And don't stop that line. If you miss one crankshaft, we'll fire you. At General Motors, the workers come and go, but the assembly line never stops moving. It moves as fast as men can bolt seats and doors and crankshafts onto cars, and then it moves faster. The heat wave passes, but the despised speed up, as the men call it, is an unceasing feature of factory life. Whenever there's a gap in the line as a result of a part shortage, the foreman speeds up the tempo for the rest of the day to ensure the plant produces its quota. At the beginning of a shift, the line might move at 40 cars an hour, but by the end it can be cranked up to 60. This is faster than the lines are engineered to run, so cars jerk forward under the stress of the speed. A trim line worker whose job is to tack headlinings to an auto seat, pounds the tack into his finger when the car lurches suddenly. His foreman tells him that lunch is coming in 15 minutes, so we can go to the infirmary then. By the end of the day, the men are working so frantically that everyone is clustered at the end of the line because they haven't been able to keep up with the cars as they pass by. Workers arrive at the shop an hour early to lay out their parts, the only way to keep up with the pace of auto assembly and thus avoid getting fired. A factory wife complains that her wrung-out husband comes home so exhausted that, quote, he throws himself on the floor and he can't sometimes hold a fork in his hand afterwards. A man whose job is to wipe down bodies at the end of the line with a gasoline-soaked rag doesn't have time to bring it out between jobs. The cars come at him so fast. He spatters gasoline on himself, burning his arms and legs. The unceasing approach of auto bodies drives him so mad he begins to hallucinate and hear bells ringing. His brother drives up from Detroit to take him home. Most men aren't driven crazy, but many are driven to drink. When the line is running, it doesn't just run fast, it runs unceasingly. 9 hours a weekday and 5 on Saturday, Christmas Eve, New Year's Eve. You have to put in the time to save enough money for the next layoff. After work, men drown their exhaustion in beer gardens. Families come to know their fathers as drunk, tired, and surly. The man was so driven by the speed up inside the factory that he came home unable to be a decent companion either to his wife or children, and she had to take an awful lot of bad treatment from her husband, one worker's wife would recall. When a person is driven beyond human endurance, you become so resentful inside yourself, it's got to spill out somewhere. Not only is the work exhausting, it's dirty and dangerous. Workers dare not step off the assembly lines, even to use the toilet. There are no fans, no ventilation, no dust masks, no safety glasses. A man named Neil Yaklin works half blind because a chip flies off a chisel when he's driving rails into car bodies, 40 or 50 rails a minute, and lodges in his eye. He loses the eye but keeps working because there's no disability pay or unemployment insurance. There is no health insurance either, so it takes Yaklin 4 years and an appeal to the state labor board to get $1,800 for his missing eye. Presses chop fingers off, hands, even a leg. In the nickel plating department, where workers apply the finish to radiator grills and buffing wheels, the lye and lime dust settle in men's hair and depilates their heads. The dust is so thick that sometimes all you could do is stand there and cough for a couple of minutes, the worker later recalls. If you had said anything to a foreman then about wearing a mask to protect your nose and mouth, he would have called you a sissy. That sweltering summer, a labor organizer appears in Flint. So he's a stranger in town. And I wonder, you can ask me some questions. I want to find the part where you're talking about, we were talking about how we can just talk about, you can be fired for any reason. They would say if the foreman wanted his brother-in-law on the line, one day you just find a red slip in your envelope. So there's no job security. And as we were talking about
due process.
Right.
There were no rules.
Yeah, there were no committeemen. And if farmers, people who worked on farms had an advantage because they could bring food to their foreman. And as you were saying, if the foreman wanted you to paint his house, you had to go paint his house. If he wanted you to throw him a party, you had to throw him a party. And if you got fresh with your wife, you had to look the other way. And the workers didn't know how much money they were going to earn. There was a base rate and then there was a piece rate, and every week they felt they were getting shortchanged. If the line shut down, they lost money even though it wasn't their fault. So none of the labor protections that we now take for granted did they have in Flint in 1936.
What struck me about that section was, obviously you were describing a historical moment in time, but I thought you also really masterfully sketched out what it was like and the physical and the psychological impacts of working under conditions without guaranteed pay rates, without the right to breaks, without control over the speed and how you execute your work, without the right to health care, and where injury or age could all of a sudden jettison you from being able to earn the wages that sustain life. And that's that's a timeless scenario. It's not specific to 1936, but here it was right before, a mysterious a stranger
Mysterious-
arrived
Right.
to
Well,
take a stab at where organizers had tried before and maybe were not as successful. So what was different at this moment?
well, I think there was a new union, the United Auto Workers. John L. Lewis had sort of led the industrial unions out of the CIO, and he formed the AFL. And so this new, there was an existing United Auto Workers, but there was a new union, there was new, more militant leadership. And there was the Wagner Act, which gave workers the right to bargain collectively. That had been passed in 1935. Michigan had just elected a New Deal governor, Frank Murphy, whose name should be familiar to Detroiters. His name is on the Frank Murphy Hall of Justice, the courthouse. And they really tried to time the beginning of the sit-down strike to Murphy's inauguration. Murphy had been elected with the support of labor, and he knew that labor he was going to need it if he was going to get elected again. So they felt that he was going to be more sympathetic than the outgoing Republican governor. So they wanted to wait until after January 1st. They weren't actually able to wait that long. December 30th, GM started moving dies out of Fisher One. They concentrated on Fisher One because it contained dies that were used to stamp out parts used in cars all in GM plants all over the country. So if they could control that plant, they could shut down automaking everywhere. And GM started to move dies out, and they had this strike headquarters across the street, and there was a red light on it called the flicker. They put the flicker on, so everybody had to go across the street for the union meeting. And so then they said, "This is it. Tonight, this is when the strike is going to begin." Let me see if I can find that part. Okay, I can read a little bit of that part too. And the moment when the strike, I don't think I've actually read this part in any time. Lewis Strickland, the union's steward in metal finishing. Let me see if I can see that. Okay, here we go. Travis, Mort, Martin, John L. Lewis, the entire UAWA leadership wanted to wait until January 1st. Okay. I'll start here. All right. On the evening of the 30th, Bob Travis is working at the Pengelly building when he receives a frantic telephone call from Walter Ananick out inside Fisher One. And Walter Ananick is the great uncle of State Senator Jim Ananick of Flint. They're moving the dice out, Bob. Ananick shouts into the receiver. "You sure?" Travis asked. "Yeah, the boys in the press room working near the doors by the railroad dock say they got crank press dies on some trucks and they're loading a flock of freight cars." "Okay," Travis says, "they're asking for it. Tell the boys steward's meeting at lunchtime." Travis calls down to the UAWA office on Saginaw Street, across from Fisher One. "Put the flicker on," he orders the woman who answers the phone. The flicker is a 200-watt red light bulb above the door of the Saginaw Street office. When lit, it's a signal to the workers that a union meeting is about to take place. Adding to the urgency of capturing Fisher One is the fact that this morning, workers in Fisher 2 and Flint sat down on the job, shutting down production on the first shift. Travis, Mort, Martin, John L. Lewis, the entire UAWA leadership wanted to wait until January 1st. But GM is forcing the union to act now. If those dies get out of Fisher One, the plant will be a worthless prize because GM will be able to continue stamping out body parts somewhere else. The union boss decides that December 30th is close enough. Governor Fitzgerald's term has 40 hours left to run. He won't be able to roust them from the plant in that short of time. At 8 o'clock, second shift's lunch hour, Travis's deputies file across the street and into the spare standing room all in the union office, furnished sparsely with a kitchen table and 2 wooden chairs. "Boys, we'll make this snappy," Travis tells the stewards. "I understand there's something happening over there in the press room dock." "That's right," a steward replies. "They're taking dies out of the press room. They got 4 or 5 cars lined up there." "Well," Travis asks, "what are we going to do about it?" "Them's our jobs," the worker responds. "We want them right here in Flint." "That's right," men shout in unison. "I'm not going to tell you what to do," Travis says. "That ought to be plain enough to you if you want to protect your jobs. In my plant in Toledo, General Motors walked off with 1,500 jobs a year ago. In Cleveland, Fisher Body struck Monday to save theirs. What do you want to do? Shut her down. Shut the goddamn plant." "Okay, fellas, that's what I wanted to hear you say. Now, the important thing to remember from here on out is discipline. You can't have too much of it in a strike, especially at the beginning. Reuther and I will come in after you shut the plant down and help you get everything organized. Bud Simons and the rest of the committee will be in charge. You'll have to enlarge the committee so as to get representation on it from all departments. Remember, obviously, no liquor, and tell the girls in the cut and sew department to go home and come around to the Pengelly headquarters tomorrow morning. We'll have plenty of work for them to do. Now, everyone stays until the warning whistle. We don't want any stooges tipping off the company ahead of time. So they sent home all the women in the plant. They didn't want any talk about what might be going on between men and women in the plant, and that might have undermined support from home. But the women, and I can talk about this a little later, did form a women's emergency brigade to support the strikers. The men stream back toward the factory gate. Travis follows them outside as far as the sidewalk, where he paces back and forth on the ice, watching the windows for a sign from the workers inside that their plot has succeeded or failed. He thinks to himself, this is where the fight begins. Lewis Strickland, the union steward in metal finishing, returns from lunch and tells the men in his department, this here's it. There's a sit-down strike. Everyone is to sit right here. At 9:30, the whistle blows, signaling the end of the lunch break and the resumption of work on the second shift. The lines begin moving, but in every department, there's a steward who has just returned from the meeting across the street with instructions to order his co-workers to stop working. Bud Simons is in charge of the spot welders. In all of Flint, the union has about 4,500 members, but it doesn't take that many to shut down a plant. Earlier that day, 50 workers at Fisher 2 sat down, halting their work of 1,000 and inciting an occupation of the plant. And plenty of workers sympathized with the union's aims, but have been afraid to sign a membership card. The sit-down doesn't happen all at once. When the trim line starts moving, none of the men move with it, having been told by their steward, we're not going to work. Frozen on their benches, they stare at the bodies going by for a minute, 5 minutes, knowing that if enough of them break ranks, they'll have to work like blazes to get caught up. After 10 minutes of inaction, the foreman comes running out of his office. He stalks up and down the trim line, giving each of the mutineers a death stare. But nobody breaks. Finally, the foreman shuts off the trim line himself. In metal finishing, Joe Devitt, a close ally of Simons's, walks up and down the line, passing the word to stop working and step away from the machines. For the strikers, the silence is the sound of success. The press room, where the all-important die stamp out body parts, is the best organized department in the shop. Almost all the workers there are union. Once the press room gets the order to sit down, it happens so quickly that, in 5 minutes, you would have thought that you were in a morgue, but for the foreman, as busy as little bees trying to get the men back on the job, as one worker later writes. The stymied foremen head to the main office to ask for instructions on how to get the press room stamping out parts again. While they are gone, workers from the roof department and the quarter panel department arrive. They know how important it is to prevent the company from shipping out the dies. By 10:30, an hour after the whistle blows, every line in Fisher 1 has stopped running. Walter Rannick leans out a third-floor window, shouting and waving his arms to get the attention of Travis, who's still pacing the sidewalk across the street. Hooray, Bob, Rannick cries, she's ours. All across the glass grid on the factory's face, windows are popping open. Grinning faces of auto workers appear in the frames. Was there any trouble? Travis shouts back, nah. Meanwhile, workers are occupying the railroad loading dock to prevent the company from removing dies. They're told that only one die is being shipped to Lansing for repairs. The workers believe the company secretly intends to empty the plant by shipping out small panel molding dies. They're convinced that after the night shift goes home, Jim will load the bigger dies onto the rail cars. If there's just one guy going to Lansing, the workers wonder, then why are all these freight cars lined up at the loading dock? When a locomotive engine backs up and hook onto the train, workers gather beneath the cab. There's a strike on, they call to the engineer. The engineer understands. He steps out of his cab, signals to the brakeman to step down too. The train won't be going to Lansing or Grand Rapids or anywhere else, and neither will the dies. Now that the workers have control of Fisher 1, they have to figure out what to do with it. They start by sending home the women in the cut and sew department. The strikers want to spare the women from any violence in case company goons or police attempt to retake the plant. They also want to prevent GM from undermining support from their wives at home, the so-called strike widows, with crude speculation on what might be going on between lonely husbands and working women. Bud Simons talks up and down the stilled assembly lines, carrying a pencil and Bluebird's school series notebook in which he jots down memos and writes out orders. His first entry, women have to have 5 minutes to leave the plant. And so they stream out into the cold in their overalls and working caps. They're going home. The men are staying. For how long, they don't know. That's the moment the sit-down strike began.
I mean, you're describing a situation where the company has complete control over the production process and
Right.
the physical domain of the plant, and the workers have suddenly wrested it away.
Right. And, that's why the company wouldn't negotiate for the longest time. They said that, you're trespassing. You're on our property. We're not going to talk to you while you're trespassing. And that, they went to court and they were able to get an injunction. They got a court injunction from a judge ordering
A judge who
the
had
workers to leave.
a General
judge who
Motors
owns stock,
stockholder.
yeah, the judge who owns stock in General Motors. And so the head of the UAW asked the legislature to impeach him, but that didn't happen. And
And then the sheriff tried to serve the injunction, and the workers.
the sheriff served the injunction, and they kind of hooted him down. And this all culminated in what's called the Battle of the Running Bulls, which took place on January 12th, when the Flint police attacked the plant, and they were repelled by workers, with fire hoses and throwing milk bottles and door hinges. They had door hinges lined up along the windows to throw at anybody who might attack the plant. And as the police were retreating, they started shooting at the strikers, and they wounded 14 strikers. And that was the moment when Governor Murphy sent the National Guard into Flint. And I mean, legally, he could have used the National Guard to expel the workers from the plants. He's the chief law enforcement officer of the state, and there's a court injunction saying they have to leave. But what he did instead was order the National Guard to surround the plants and get between the workers and to get between the police and the strikers to make sure that there was no further violence in Flint.
That was what was so striking to me as I read that. I mean, so often the National Guard has been used as a way to quell social disruption. Right. And in this case, they were used as a buffer between local law enforcement and workers.
Well, in the Homestead strike in Pennsylvania in 1892, the National Guard was used to break the strike.
Yes, they slaughtered strikers and their families and children.
Right, and even later that year in 1937, there was a Republic Steel massacre in Chicago where the police, killed 10 strikers.
Yeah, I mean this was not that long ago in strikers' minds, and
right.
And yet, in this case, it was understood that the National Guard was being used to help them stay in the plant instead of attacking them.
Right. And they considered Murphy an ally, and Murphy, he was able to get GM and the union to come to Lansing and negotiate an agreement. They thought they actually had an agreement, and just as they were getting ready to march out of the plant, the union found out that GM was going to talk to an anti-strike group called the Flint Alliance, and they said no, that wasn't the deal. We were supposed to have exclusive representation, and they called off. They marched back in. Well, they marched back into the plant. They never marched out of the plant, so they called off the evacuation, and from there the strike it went to the federal level. That's when Francis Perkins and Franklin D. Roosevelt and John L. Lewis all started to get involved. But we should talk a little bit more about the women's emergency.
Yes. So
brigade.
I loved how you did. I mean, you laid the groundwork by describing all of these different social dynamics that both the union leaders and the women were trying to negotiate by being careful about how they were being perceived to be either participating or contributing, that individual
Right.
women activists had to be very careful as not being seen to be usurping the men's rightful place
Right.
in the, but yet they were also totally willing to play with those stereotypes if it meant that they were able to say best the police in the streets, police
Right.
that they knew were unwilling to strike a woman. So it's just a fascinating role, and it's clear that they played a pretty pivotal part in the solidarity efforts.
Well, here's kind of how it started. There's a woman named Janora Johnson who was the leader, and she was the star of. There was a movie, I think it came out in 1979, called "With Babies and Banners," And it was a documentary about the Women's Emergency Brigade, 40 years later. And, her papers are in your library. So that's where I worked with them. So it started during the Battle of the Running Bulls. And this is Janora Johnson, who was rushed over from the Pengelly building after hearing the strikers were being denied food, asked Reuther if she too can address the crowd from the sound car. He hands her the microphone. "These men had no firearms," Johnson shouts. "They were defenseless in the face of firearms. I ask all the women here tonight to come down and stand with your husbands and brothers. If the police are cowards enough to shoot down defenseless men, they're cowards enough to shoot down women. Women of the city of Flint, break through these police lines and come down here and stand with your husbands and your brothers, your sons and your sweethearts." In response to Johnson's exhortation, women surge toward the plan. As they pass through the police lines, one has her overcoat torn off by a cop. But the police don't stop the women, nor do they fire again once there's a danger of hitting one. Having been repulsed once and facing a hostile crowd, the police hold their position on the bridge, only occasionally to save face, lobbing a gas bomb that illuminates the sky above the plant. The Flint police run out of gas shells at midnight. They appeal to Detroit for more, but are told that none can be spared. Sheriff Walcott himself halts an attempt to distribute rifles for a second attack. "There's going to be no shooting here," he tells Chief Wills. "I'm the leading law enforcement officer in the county during any troubles, and those are my orders." So Janora Johnson, she's, she was a high school dropout. She dropped out of high school to get married, but she's a woman who is educated in socialist literature, socialist causes. She had brought Walter Reuther to speak in Flint at the Masonic Temple earlier in the 1930s. Her husband is a striker, and so she goes down to the Pengelly building and wants to get involved. And they said, well, here you can go to the kitchen and peel potatoes. She wants to do more than that. So she organizes a wives and children's picket line, and she paints a little placard for her 2-year-old son that says, "My daddy strikes for us little tykes." And after the Battle of the Running Bulls, that's when she organizes the Women's Emergency Brigade. She says, "We've got to organize the women," Janora Johnson declares that night. "We've got to have a military formation of the women. If the cops stop firing into the men, the women can take the frontline ranks. Let them dare to shoot women." The next day, 50 mothers, daughters, wives, and sisters gather at the Pengelly building in answer to Janora's call for women willing to place their bodies between police and strikers. "It can't be somebody who's weak of heart," Janora announces. "You can't get hysterical if your sister beside you drops down in a pool of blood. We can't be bothered with having to take care of 2 people if one is injured and another is going to go hysterical. Do not sign up for the Women's Brigade. Take your role in the strike kitchen. Take your role in the first aid station in the Ladies Auxiliary. The first to stand is a woman in her 70s. This is going to be difficult for you," Janora cautions. "You can't keep me out," the old woman insists. "My son's working in that factory. My husband worked in that factory before he died, and I have grandsons there." The women applaud as the grandmother steps forward and signs her name to the register. Next to sign is a teenage girl. "My father works in that factory," she says. "My brothers work in that factory. I've got a right to join too. Of the 1,000 women who belong to the Ladies Auxiliary, 400 join the Women's Emergency Brigade," as Janora names the paramilitary wing. "Every member is issued a red beret and a red armband with the white letters EB. Janora appoints herself captain, the highest military rank she can think of. Tall, with raw bone features, a deep background in socialist rhetoric, and an authoritative manner, Janora is a natural command. She's on a first name basis with strike leaders most brigade members have only read about in the newspapers. That makes the other women look up to her. Her 5 lieutenants each command a squadron ready to gather outside a factory at the summons of a phone call. One of Janora's lieutenants is Nellie Masson. Masson considers the captain a born leader with drive and direction and is flattered by the appointment. She wears her red beret and her armband everywhere, even though she considers the choice of color unfortunate because of its association with communism. She adopts a military-style costume of jodhpurs, a waist-length jacket, and knee-high boots, and she arms herself. Nellie's father suggests she carry a bar of soap inside a bobby sock because the police can't claim that's a concealed weapon. But Nellie decides she needs something that can do a little more damage. When the men inside Fisher one, she acquires a blackjack, attaching it to a wristlet concealed inside her sleeve, so she can flick it out at the first sign of trouble. All the women in the brigade carry billy clubs whose handles have been whittled down to fit a female grip. Although they're not allowed to sit down inside the plant, the militarized women believe they're just as important as the men to the strike's success. The red beret became a symbol of a new type of woman who was ready to sacrifice her life as the men felt they were gaining the victories we won from the world's largest corporations in order, tells the documentary filmmaker Lorraine Gray decades later. And so they went into action. The strike was stalemated, and there was a ploy to take over Chevrolet 4, which was an engine plant that produced engines for all GM cars. And they had a diversionary tactic at Chevy 9, a ball bearing plant, and the Planet Police were firing tear gas, and the women's brigade, they were there on the sidewalk with their flag, and the guy sticks his head out the window saying, there's tear gas, and so out come all the billy clubs from under their long coats, and they start smashing the windows so the tear gas can escape. And the next day the next day in the paper, I think it's in the Flint Journal. The next day's New York Times reports direct under the headline, "Women's Brigade uses heavy clubs." And the Flint Journal writes, "These women smashed scores of windows in the plant in a hysterical frenzy, seemingly with an urge to destroy, for officials could find no other reason for smashing glass and window after window." And I don't know if you can see it on the cover, you can see the broken windows here. That's from that incident. So some people want to put a statue of George Johnson up in downtown Flint, along with the statues of Buick and Durant and Champion.
I mean, solidarity it's a community endeavor.
Right.
For workers to be able to hold out inside the plant, or to even keep it going on a tactical and strategic level, that requires a sense of community and support to carry out.
Right, and there is a sit-down strikers memorial outside of UAW Hall in Flint, and it does show a woman with a club breaking a window. But yeah, they had this. They had to have the support of their families, or they couldn't have done it. And I mean, they would the families. They would come and hoist meals up through the windows. So they actually had a strike. They actually had a strike kitchen across the street, but they had people, their wives and their children. They were working in the strike kitchen and feeding the strike.
And I mean, that's where the National Guard had a role to play in allowing the food to continue in. And I saw at various points you describe how, whether it was heat or even just food deliveries being cut off at various points by GM, or at various points in the negotiations.
Right. Well, I think they cut off the heat in Chevy 4 after they captured Chevy 4, and then I think it was Bob Travis said, well, or maybe it might have been Roy Reuther. He said, if these guys don't have heat, they're going to start setting fires in there. You want that to happen? Yeah. And so I think Murphy personally ordered them to put the heat back on. But I mean, the company didn't want violence. At least Lawrence Fisher didn't want violence. He said, I don't care if I don't make another nickel. I don't want any bloodshed in the Fisher body plants. The big sticking point was Alfred P Sloan. He's, his name I think is probably best known. He was the benefactor of the Sloan Kettering Memorial Center, and there's also a Sloan Museum in Flint. But he was the chairman of General Motors, and he worked in New York, so he was a little more removed from all this. He was a little less in touch, and he was refusing to negotiate as long as the workers occupied the plants. And Frances Perkins, the Secretary of Labor, the first woman who was in a presidential cabinet, she went to work on him personally. She tried to get Walter Chrysler to work on him. She thought they had an agreement, and
I mean, these exhaustive brokering attempts.
Right.
I mean, it's a juxtaposition between like the urgency of the sit-down events, but then it just goes into this excruciating negotiations back and forth, and the egos and all of the attempts over time.
Well, she thought they had agreements so that the union could bargain for members who worked for the company, for the members who worked for the company, but not for everybody who worked for the company. And he backs out. And Frances Perkins just, she's just pretty proper New England do-gooder type, but she just goes ballistic. She says, "Mr. Sloan, you can't do that. You told me I could go ahead and make that proposal without saying that you agreed to it. I haven't said that you would agree to anything, but I made the proposal." And she said, "Mr. Sloan, you gave your word in front of witnesses. You're a scoundrel and a skunk, Mr. Sloan. You can't do that kind of thing. That is a rotter. That's a quitter. You've deceived people. You've misled people. You don't deserve to be counted among decent men. You'll go to hell when you die if you do things like that. Are you a grown man, Mr. Sloan, or are you a neurotic adolescent?" And Sloan says, "You can't talk to me like that. You can't talk to me like that. I'm Alfred Sloan. I've got 70 million and I made it all myself. You can't talk to me like that." I wish I could do, Sloan had this great Brooklyn accent, this great kind of dead end kids Brooklyn accent. And then, I would have loved it. And Perkins, she had this sort of fluty voice like Eleanor Roosevelt. So I would have loved to hear the contrast between the two of them as they talk. She sounded very refined, and he sounded like he was from the streets, even though he was a rich executive. So at that point, Franklin D. Roosevelt had to get involved. He had to call William Knudsen, the GM vice president. I think they cut Sloan out of the loop after that. GM was only going to accept an order to the bargaining table from the president himself. I mean, obviously that's how GM saw its position in the industrial hierarchy, in the American hierarchy. So they, Knudsen and John L. Lewis and the GM executives and the AFL leadership, they all, and Murphy, all go to a hotel in Detroit where they finally, hammer out an agreement. So the workers get an extra 5 cents an hour, but that's not the important thing. They always say the strike wasn't about money. It was about dignity. It was about working conditions. And so they get a guarantee that there will be time studies instead of a speed up, that they get a guarantee that layoffs will be based on seniority. And not just whoever wants whoever the foreman wants to get rid of. And actually, I thought Perkins made an interesting observation that GM might have bought it on itself because they were, always getting rid of the old workers and just hiring these, young bucks. And, these were the guys who, had the vim and the vigor to start a strike on them.
Exactly. They brought in the foot soldiers of the sit-down.
Right.
Ultimately.
Right. Exactly.
I mean, so what I came back to over and over again as I read this was just thinking about how it takes incredible courage for workers to organize, right? Like, especially those in low wage or really dangerous industries, or those where the employer has basic a geographic capture where there's no other business in town to work for. Right. So there's like so much risk and so much social pressure and so few rewards in actually trying to change things. And yet workers still do it again and again. And I mean, if you came up in the past 20 years, we hear all about this new economy where the old industries are dead. We have a new service economy. Work is different. These old modes of union organizing aren't relevant anymore. But we've also seen recent high-profile efforts by Amazon workers in Alabama to organize, rideshare and delivery drivers rising up during the pandemic, Tesla employees in California, and then like wildcat strikes by teachers and right to work strikes. I mean, the new economy is looking a whole lot like the old economy.
I agree, but unfortunately they can't do this again because a few years after this happened, the strikes were ruled illegal by the National Labor Relations Board, and that was upheld by the Supreme Court. So if you occupy, if you occupy your employer's property as part of a strike, they can fire you. They can fire you,
and they can hire replacement workers.
Exactly.
Precisely.
Once they get you out of there.
Exactly.
however they do that.
Exactly. So if like that tactic is no longer an option,
well, I thought that there were a lot of resonances between this and what was going on in Alabama, but I read an interesting article which kind of jived with what I've been thinking, is that lately the union movement is becoming a white collar movement. It's the workers who feel like they're hardest to replace who are the ones who are willing to risk joining a union. knowledge workers at, universities and newspapers, and industrial workers they're afraid. They're afraid that, since they're unskilled, that they can just go out and find anybody to replace them if they start a union.
I mean, the lessons of the past 30 years have taken its toll. I mean,
right. Yeah.
And then if workers haven't experienced their jobs being outsourced, their family members have, or their fathers have, or they've seen their whole region or town being diminished by a plant relocating. Those are harsh lessons to learn.
And the image that we grew up with in Michigan of the union member as an auto worker is kind of obsolete. Most union members are, the public sector is much more unionized than the private sector, and I think pretty soon a majority of union members will be women.
The dynamics have changed.
Right.
Three years ago, leading up to the Janus v. AFSCME decision by the Supreme Court, people were saying this was the death knell for public sector unionism. And there was a big internal organizing drive by SCU and AFSCME. And what happened? Membership is higher than it was before. I mean, that's like a very, summary outcome, but I think you can only push workers so far. Yeah,
but the number of automaking jobs has diminished so much in Michigan. So that's diminished UAW, that's diminished its power. There's no way that the state could have passed a right to work law when there were still 1 million members in the UAW. And now I think it's down to maybe about 400,000. And so I think the biggest victory of the anti-union movement hasn't been busting these unions. It's been preventing the unionization of the jobs that replaced these well-paying industrial jobs.
And I mean, they don't just go to countries where there's no attempt at organizing. Workers always try and organizing, and what that crackdown looks like from location to location looks different. And workers fight back wherever they are. But I think it's also fascinating to look at UAW's inroads into, say, higher education. Where they've been incredibly successful, but that changes the dynamic of an organization.
They represented the National Writers Union, which I belonged to for a while. Although I think they've since separated. But you're right. Yeah, they're looking anywhere they can go. They're organizing teaching assistants.
My husband was in the NYU graduate student strike of a few years ago.
Well, did Christine say that she was in the UAW?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
It's a dynamic organization.
My region added a unit to our local, and their attorneys and paralegals.
Okay. All right. I wonder if most UAW members build cars at this point.
I think
in Region 1 still, yes.
Okay.
In where Lansing is, no. Because that's state workers. The largest local in region, I think that's Region 2, but I could be wrong, is Local 6000, which is state.
Okay. Well, every year,
but so many internationals have diversified. I mean, the Teamsters is known as a general union now. They're in every industry.
Yeah. Well, every year in Flint, every February 11th, they still have White Shirt Day, which is a commemoration of the end of the sit-down strike, and they all wear white shirts, and that was supposed to be to symbolize that they were white shirts to work, to symbolize that they were on an equal footing with management.
For the attendees, if anyone has a question, you can put it in the chat, because we're getting close to 7 o'clock. We can go. We have enough time if
okay, yeah, I'd be happy to answer any questions. And I don't know if I can I put in the chat where people can write me if they want an autographed copy of the book?
Yes.
Let's see.
And email me, you can email it to me too, because I can send it to the attendees.
Okay.
And in Detroit, the book is available for sale at Page's Bookstore on Grand River.
Oh yeah, Page's is a great bookstore. Are they open again? Didn't they have a fire?
Yes, they're open.
Okay, I've done a couple book readings there for other books. Okay, here's a question. Thank you for this.
Oh, someone wrote in the chat, Thank you for this provocative, enlightening story of General Motors. I will definitely read it, but I wish my father had the opportunity to. He was a GM man at the Framingham plant in Framingham, Massachusetts. He never missed a day of work. He always prided himself as a dedicated worker. 5 years into his retirement, by mail, he was informed that his benefits were under attack. He was not a union member because he was in security. Together with a group of retired members in the same situation, and personally funded a group with legal acknowledgement to bring GM to court. After many years, the benefits were not touched, but the situation profoundly affected my father. So I guess fast forward from the 30s to the 80s, storylines never change. Thank you, Carol.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah, that's true. I mean, the line workers were guaranteed lifetime health benefits, but nobody else was, certainly not the white collar workers, and apparently not the security either.
Well, security is generally not covered by the National Labor Relations Act.
Okay.
So I've seen them in the various industries I've worked in adjacent to. They become particularly vulnerable because there's no recourse except for like going directly to the courts.
Right.
Okay.
Somebody else. Oh, here's another one. I'm a Wayne State history grad and the lead tour guide at the Fisher Building. Your book was a great resource for me as I tried to paint a more clear picture of the labor that produced the money that built that building. Thank you so much for your work. The Fisher Building is a beautiful building. Everyone should visit when they go to Detroit. I love the mural of the state of Michigan on the wall back there. Wait, am I thinking of the right one? Is Fisher Building is a new city, right?
Mm-hmm. New center. It's on the boulevard.
I'm thinking of a different building downtown. I wonder which one, but yeah, WJR were always the Guardian. Thank you. Yeah, but WJR always said that they were transmitting from the Golden Tower of the Fisher Building.
Yep.
Yeah.
I live relatively down the street from the Fisher, and during the shutdown, when there was not much to do in Detroit but kind of wander around, you could still get in the Fisher Building and you get to see all the ornate details and the mural.
Yeah.
And just
so I guess I don't think I've actually been inside the Fisher Building. Okay, next time I'm in Detroit, I'll go inside.
It's a beautiful building. Yeah, I used to work down the street from the Fisher Building, so.
Okay.
Detroit is a marvel. I mean, this whole area, Southeast Michigan, is absolutely gorgeous and a testament to labor.
Oh, I need to ask this question.
Okay.
My former UAW director, who was just elected Secretary Treasurer of the UAW, I was discussing this program with him, and he wants to know, when is someone going to write a new book about what happened in Detroit as far as strikes and the development of the UAW? So are you interested in doing that, Ed? You'll have some cooperation if you do.
I got another book proposal out there. It's not a labor book proposal, and I chose this one specifically because it was about one incident. There was a dramatic narrative and larger than life characters. And I should mention, I never mentioned that I was really fortunate that U of M Flint conducted oral histories with the sit-down strikers in the late 70s and early 80s. And so I was able to get a lot of dialogue, a lot of the workers' personal stories there. And there was also, there were a couple books, The Many and the Few by Henry Krauss, that provided a lot of firsthand dialogue and organized by Wyndham Mortimer, and also Frances Perkins's own oral history at Columbia University. She talked extensively about the sit-down strike and recreated a lot of scenes. So it was really all that was really helpful to me in trying to write a book in the dramatic style that I hoped I wrote it in.
You also trained as a historian. Was that while you were writing this?
A little bit before, yeah.
A little bit before.
Yeah, so I got a master's degree in history, and I'd written journalistic books before, but I'd always wanted to write a history book, and so I guess this is the first one. I'm going back to Flint early next month. The U of M hired me to work on its they're going to update the WPA guide to Michigan. And they want me to write about the history of automaking, the rise and fall of automaking in the Saginaw Valley in Flint and Saginaw. So I'm going to go back to Flint and Saginaw to do some research on that.
Oh, okay, that sounds like some good work.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
I'll keep an eye out for that. It's really exciting. And I mean, as part of an institution that maintains oral history collections,
Right.
collects new ones, tries to acquire ones as we come across them. I mean, we've found that they're just such an invaluable way to connect people with history and the lived experiences of people that aren't with us anymore. They're more compelling than in some ways than reading other types of documentation.
Well, there was that little, I don't know if you remember, when I was reading about the beginning of the sit-down strike, it was like about Travis writing in his Bluebird notebook. You have that notebook. And so I just took it out of his handwritten notes in that notebook. You know, you have the papers, his papers. Yep. Yeah.
You also talked about, you know, Mary Horton Voice and her coverage of it. We have her papers as well.
Oh,
and
do you? Okay. I didn't actually look at her papers there, but she had a book called Labor's New Millions, in which she, maybe I did look at them, but it definitely, I did look at her book, Labor's New Millions, in which she wrote about her experiences in Flint.
We're also in the middle of a grant-funded project by the Walter and May Reuther Memorial Fund to digitize the presidential papers of Walter Reuther. Not all of them, because it's massive, but certain sections of them, and to digitize fragile audio and film recordings from the very beginnings of the UAW. So we're really excited to share the outcomes of that in the coming years.
Is Reuther open to researchers yet?
We are, right now we're currently open to Wayne State affiliates, but we are very much ramping up for broader access in the next month or so. I expect by the time fall semester kicks off, we'll be back to our normal access, which of course, because I started in March 2020, I was never here to experience.
Right, U of M has the Frank Murphy papers. And, he lost his re-election partly because of the sit-down strike, but then he was appointed Attorney General and Supreme Court Justice, so he got the last laugh.
Exactly. He played it well.
Yeah.
Well, it's 7:06, so I'm going to say thank you to the both.
Thank you. Thank you for having me in Detroit. The Detroit Public Library downtown is a beautiful, one of probably the most beautiful public library. Well, all right, maybe after New York Public Library, but it's right up there.
Great cities have great libraries.
Yes, they do. Yes. All right, well, thank you very much, Detroit. See you soon.
Please visit us next time. You know, always welcome at their library. Thank you so much, Christine.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good evening.
Have a good evening.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Okay, good evening. Good night.